What this festival does is to bring together authors and audiences for lively readings and conversations about literature and society. And I can assure you that the poets and the speakers we're going to have tonight are going to be lively. So I'm really, really looking forward to tonight's event. This year, for the festival, we're so happy to partner with the People's Forum, where we are right now, the Evergreen Review, based in New York City, PN Review in the UK, NYU's Post-Colonial Race and Diaspora Studies Colloquium, and NYU's Asian Pacific American Institute, Singapore's Ethos Books, which is a wonderful independent press in Singapore, and the Asian American Writers Workshop to bring you this festival. The festival theme this year is Archipelago Dreaming. As the world becomes ever more interconnected and interdependent, the ideas of the Martinican writer and philosopher Eduardo Glissant become even more relevant. Calling for a change in our thinking, Glissant wrote, and I quote, "We need archipelagic thinking, which is one that opens, one that confirms diversity, one that is not made to obtain unity, but rather a new kind of relation." Our hope is that this 3-day festival will build many new kinds of relation among us and offer us new ideas for relations when we return to our communities and institutions. There are events in the afternoon and the evening of each day. We're now into day 2. So there is day 3 tomorrow. Please come back, all right, for our afternoon and evening events in this same space. It is entirely appropriate that we are holding most of this year's events here at the People's Forum. The People's Forum is a movement incubator for working class and marginalized communities to build unity across historic lines of division in this country and abroad. As an incubator, the People's Forum provides an accessible educational and cultural space that nurtures the next generation of visionaries and organizers who believe that collective action, all right, with collective action, a new world is possible. Singapore Unbound shares the same vision, and we are very proud to partner with the People's Forum for this festival. We're very excited about tonight's event, Re-envisioning the Epic for Our Time. Reading and discussing their work are 3 terrific poets, Vivek Narayanan, originally from India, Jay Gao from Scotland, Hamid Roslan from Singapore. And moderating the conversation is the distinguished poetry scholar, Dorothy Wang. Dorothy Wang, professor of American Studies at Williams College, is the author of Thinking Is Presence, Form, Race, and Subjectivity in Contemporary Asian American Poetry, which won the Association for Asian American Studies 2016 award for Best Book of Lyric Criticism and was included in the New Yorker's magazine's year-end list, The Books We Loved, in 2016. She also conceived of and co-founded Race and Poetry and Poetics in the UK, Rapapok, an initiative that opened up discussions of race and colonialism in UK poetry. Wang has also contributed essays to numerous places. She is the recipient of an ACLS Frederick Burkhardt Fellowship as well. So we're so pleased and so honored that she's here to moderate tonight's discussion. Would you please put your hands together to welcome Dorothy?
Thank you, G. Can people hear me? Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, G. I wanted to thank the People's Forum and also Ethos Books for sponsoring tonight's event. And thanks you to everyone for coming out. I just have to let you know that I've had a little bit of a cold, so I have a little bit of a frog in my voice. But so if I start coughing all of a sudden, it's just because of that. So tonight we're going to, this is the order of events. We're going to have the 3 poets read for about 10 minutes each. And then I'm going to ask some questions and we're going to have a discussion, but we'll open it up with the audience because I'd really like to have a conversation with the audience after those initial questions. And I will be introducing each of the poets right before they speak. So our first reader is Vivek Narayanan. And Vivek teaches poetry at the MFA program at George Mason University. His books of poems include, he has several books of poems, include After, and you're reading from After today, right, Vivek? Which came out from the New York Review of Books this year. And he's also written many other books. His work has appeared in the Penguin Book of the Prose Poem, the Blood X Book of Contemporary Indian Poetry, and many other places. He's also a member of Poetry Daily's editorial board. So let's put our hands together to welcome Vivek.
Thanks. Can you hear me? A bit closer? How's this? Okay. Even closer? Okay. Indian musicians always fight, like, to put the mic closer and closer to them. Second. Here, where by Shiva's laser eye, desire became a wisp of smoke, forever free from the body, where in the tangle of trees and in the limbs and shoots that bind among them, the wind's fury entered the joints of beautiful boys and girls and bent them crooked, where the sons of Sagara were born to dig the soil and tear the earth in search of a stolen horse, their progeny turned to heaps of ashes, where the river Ganga brought the land to life after such devastation, only that the Asura angels might hope on to some settled end. Here, where memory burns like fat in the wildfires and in the altars that seek to tame them, where the deer is still afraid and the hunter blind. This forest was never new, Rama. It's not yours, not even after you've mastered it. So Rama is the troubled king at the heart of the Ramayana. Rama, that hero's hair dark as a crow's wing, your son is not your son. Rama, that boy still with the side locks curled, your son is not your son. Rama, that he-man of the heavy lotus eyes, your son is not your son. Rama, speechless and radiant with swords, your son is not your son. Rama, tiger among men, your son is not your son. Rama, that blank face turned to the face of Saturn, your son is not your son. Rama, may you never grow sick or tired, your son is not your son. Rama, three-headed cobra from behind, your son is not your son. Rama, that forest torn from the heart, your son is not your son. Rama, that sip of clearer water, your son is not your son. Rama, that empty, gaping dark, your son is not your son. Rama, that corpse within the corpse, your son is not your son. Rama, your nipple in the rain, your son is not your son. Rama, that reason beyond reason, your son is not your son. Rama, that sleep beyond sleep, your son is not your son. So the sort of base text, it's a kind of a writing through of Valmiki's Ramayana, which is quite different from, I would say, the Ramayana that most Indians have in their head. And one thing to understand about this society is that animal sacrifice is a sort of central part of this society, and also part of how it negotiates the relationship to violence. So, so part of what, a kind of one of the rituals for a king establishing a territory is to let a horse roam as far as possible until it's unchallenged, and then meet their challengers. And then when that is done, then there's a massive sacrifice where, several hundred animals at different levels are killed, and then the horse is strangled. And the king's wife lies with the horse for a night as an appeasement. What's strange is I was talking to this Irish poet, Paul Muldoon, and it turns out this very, very similar horse sacrifice in Irish society. Anyway, so and so these for us approaching these kinds of texts, it's we're strangers in this land in some ways, but we have to kind of reorient. So this is called, and so the Valmiki describes the sacrifice in pretty much detail, but what he doesn't tell you is the song, the ritual song that the king's wife would sing, or that perhaps a priest would sing on her behalf. So this is that song that I've made up. Song for the horse sacrifice. Black horse, transport of the sun, as your last breath leaves, I lie with you, touch you where need to be touched. How far? What grassland or mountain did you test? And did you meet the two boys your story sung? Black horse, I'll press you where need to be pressed. The fire burns, so does our gratitude accrue. You'll keep the land you've won, black horse. As your last breath leaves, I lie with you. You are the envoy of the king. I, his wife and your mistress. So let blood taste the air of lung, black horse. I'll kiss you where need to be kissed, and lick wherever you want to be licked, your flesh upon my tongue. Oh, let the weak grow weaker, let the sick remain sick. Black horse, as your last breath leaves, I lie with you. How much time do I have?
About a little over a minute, yeah.
Okay, a minute.
Well, actually 2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. Well, I think I'll just, oh God, 2 minutes. It's going to go in deciding what to read next. Oh, actually, I'll read the okay. I'll read. I know what 2 poems I'm going to read for the 2 minutes. Okay, so well, this figure of the Ganga. So Ganga is a river that's remembered across the classical world. It's Virgil mentions it in his Georgics. And then it comes up a couple of times in Dante as well. And the Italian, so it has a long, and the Italian word is Gange. But unfortunately, the British came up with Ganges, which makes it sound like a pub, So it's, but anyway, so the thing about and Ganga is that she comes repeatedly to revive the land, and she is both a river and a goddess. And so there's actually a bunch of poems, but this is her descent to earth, because she comes down with such force that she has to be poured through Shiva's dreadlocks. Ganga, dropped from the blue-black of that sky, for stray millennia lost in Shiva's locks, bursting coil after coil with a grey weft when, in a trembling flash under stellar thunder, he shook open his hair, and she wound toward the earth where the gods and the demons and the seers and caves could see that falling river coruscating like stone, blind, scorched, black shoal of fish and whole root lashing in air, and blue oxen, whinnying thatch of huts, stray block of village wall, and such grit that when she finally had been sated and had her ground, with one last spell, she had to leap straight up to shuck off all the matter that clung to her. So then, pure and clear with whispers of consecration, she could rill fresh Sita furrows into returning soil. And then this is the last one, which is there in your festival brochure. It's this, many different kinds of, I guess I've given you some of the more narrative stuff, but I won't have to tell you who Ila is because that's the story of the poem. Ila, Parvati, goddess of motherly compassion, bless me, your child, that I might give up this penis for a vulva and the hairs on my skin downy for 6 alternate months of the year. I've understood what happened now in the sacred grove where the dreadlocked one made himself female for your pleasure. In the midst of their divagating plan, in that gesture where all beings turned to she, so also did I, who was the proud king, the trespasser in that grove, so also everyone in my regiment. No, mother, I won't go back. Grant me instead that from now on I'll be not one, but 2, just as the celestial 2 are one in the blessed join. I want to know the other, then forget, then know the first as the other. I'll bear a child for Mercury, and on the mountain slope where I met you, my soldiers will become wives to the Kim Purushas, the could-be men. Parvati, mother, mother force, let me stay in the cycles of the moon and the cycles of forgetting, as man and as woman. Give me leave from the life of the king, marked and bound by the father, the altar, the white umbrella, and the iron plow.
Thank you, Vivek. That was wonderful. And our second reader today is Jay Gow. Originally from Edinburgh, Scotland, Jay is a poet and author of Imperium, which came out from Carcanet this year, plus 3 poetry chapbooks. He is contributing editor at the White Review. He is a winner of the 2022 Desperate Literature Prize for Short Fiction and the 2021 London Magazine Poetry Prize. And his work was also shortlisted for the 2022 Edwin Morgan Poetry Award. Jay earned his MFA from Brown University, and he's currently a PhD student at Columbia University in New York.
Thank you so much, Dorothy, and that was amazing, Vivek, and to set up this sort of mythic space for us to read into. My book, The Imperium, it's sort of, even though it has a Latin title, the book is inspired by the Odyssey and the sort of motifs and impressions that sort of have followed me throughout my life. And a way to sort of provide a sort of architecture for the themes that I find myself drawn towards, which is often travel, alienation. So this poem is called Persons Not Welcome. I left all my slippery toy soldiers on the washing machine lid, those wet miniatures, travel-sized men I will have to scoop up in the morning. I clutched my dirty clothes to my chest like a bouquet of limbs. In last night's omen, I was a child, lost in that hallway again. I was a newly sewn doll, longing to be filled up with sand. On a branch, I saw 3 apples made of metal, waiting to mutate. A bruise the size of an eye, leading to rust the size of my nation. Not unequal to many. These dreams are for the pre-human. One sleep for nonsense, one giant hand slipped into the earth I half bury, like a shield of silk. Half of one inert ritual, keeping peace, keeping house. My fingers churned those mercantile chests, whilst gulleting in the tall grass, in the white graves, those suited egrets, waited by the stream for their sweetbreads. Like a map, each new world opens with a knife to the body, and inside I find a sweet receipt, that paper sign, the conjured phrase I did not know was so untranslatable. Hero, what were your wanderings about? And the other poems I'll be reading, come from a sequence called Nobody, which is a sort of long sequence in this poem, and it takes its name from the name Odysseus gave to himself to escape the Cyclops' cave. And I've sort of transposed that cave into the setting of a luxury hotel where this poem takes place. Nobody. Be proud, champion. You tamed the lion. Valiant paladin, you were never afraid, mostly just bored. This island is full of noises and quests that sweeten the air. The buffet table mules underneath steel platters of aphrodisiac foods shipped in from distant lands. Light jazz stumbles in from the reception like released, recently anesthetized hostages. As if you were a beast reintroduced. You never noticed the state-of-the-art mosquitoes engineered to carry nothing until after you were bitten, an inoculating spectacle, a red archipelago of bumps, rising irritant, itching to be bathed in seawater. They can sense sugar in your sweat, in your sweet blood. Your mother used to warn about those twisted physicians, predictors of lineal, unavoidable diabetes. Nobody. Last night, you heard a mosquito curse, close, then far, then close again, to your ear nearest to the pillow, like a swelling grand piano being tuned in an adjacent suite. All day you scratched at the humming wound, that wheel in the fossa of your ear, not realizing you were even doing it, where a small gem of sap had grown like a crystal waiting to be mined. So the tempo of air felt charged forever, and all speech was made strange by your immune responses. You wish you were back in your hotel bed, listening to the scandal of a rainstorm loop through your headphones whilst it rained outside too, spectral choruses inside the white noise machine, primal archetypes inside the black light, sometimes waking you up, sometimes making you sleep or squirm again, sometimes making you dream you were crying, sometimes making you dream you were raining. You think you see her there in the clouds' music, but the distant figure is never your mother. She is only the pale dust of lightning as it splits a ship in two. Nobody. Who adorned this bar in all its camp colonial fodder? Dark wood, varnished in some synthetic chemical, a sinewy discharge pulsing from each panel. An invisible wound will never heal. A memory of a weapon, a hand, a pen, once thrust inside an opening. A body holding back its imperial breath. The fake books on the shelves could never be cut open to record the price of commodities or ancient verb tables. You could break off those lamps, which drooped like dim, melted daffodils. You could bring those twigs to your ear, politely nod along to their galvanic complaints. Remind them you are not the staff here. Then what are you? Motorized fans moved as languidly as history, pushing nothing around in their perpetually slow revolution setting, a lazy threat of decapitation. Behind the table of sweating artichokes, oysters, figs orbited by flies, resting watermelon slices weep like meat. 7 grandfather clocks prognosticate from the 7 most vital cities on the planet that there will always be sunlight beating down ceaselessly onto the pale skin of a time zone. Even the repeating wallpaper print, the same 2 continents from some cliché voyage of discovery, is mapped out indefinitely. Its pattern threatened to trap you in its endlessness, if not for that visible wall seam bisecting those islands, unevenly paired, pushed together, 2 irregular and jagged borders, 1 contact zone. Nobody. So you tell yourself to relax, to believe in the law, in the objectives of this quest. There will always be a rupture or incision the hero can hide in, new symbols you cannot tell apart, 1 familiar eye in the paper walls of a cave, calling out your fake name on an application that traffics in its globalization. You yawn, you order another drink, you repeat your mantra that the local is the only universal upon that all art builds. You decide tomorrow you will monetize that. You cross your legs, angling them towards the sum of the infinite. Nobody, and this is the last part of the poem. Within the architecture of an alternative ending, the happy hour would never end, and you had all the queer time in the nation to drink your fill, to kill the time of heroes, to conduct an autopsy on all the covert anatomies underpinning the set you are so keen to disturb and agitate, to sneak out in the morning like a wake from a ship, to go outside with a monsoon shower was as warm and pulsing as blood, to unwind and drown in its droplets that fell heavy on your skin. The rain was wordless, sentient, each able to carry a mutilated world, but each, no matter what, each, no matter your preferences, your influences, longing to return to a greater body, yet to be judged as the most irresistible, in the suspicious minds of the others. Nobody. Once this poem ends, so will the rain. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jay. Okay, our final reader tonight is Hamid Roslan, and Hamid is the author of Parse Tree, Forest Fire, which came out from Ethos Books in 2019. His other work can be found in the Asian American Writers Workshop, Asymptote, Tilted Axis Press, Minarets, the Practice, Research, and Tangential Activities Journal, the Volta, and the Quarterly Literary Review of Singapore, among others. So thank you, and Hamid, go ahead.
Thanks for that introduction. Yeah, Quarterly Literary Review Singapore is a mouthful.
Yeah.
I'm going to be reading from a collection that was published in 2019 called Parse Tree, Forest Fire. Copies of the book are available at the table behind you. And I want to construct the door into which you will walk into the poem because it's a doozy. The book is a bilingual book of Singlish and English poems. Singlish is a Creole that comes from Singapore that's comprised of the official languages of Singapore, official meaning funded and mostly supported by the government of our day. So that's English, Malay, Chinese, and Tamil. It erases many of the other languages that are spoken in Singapore. And one of the reasons why I wrote this book was to try and understand the question of why do I speak the languages I do? And this is a question that most people don't ask themselves because language is like air. You breathe it in and you breathe it out, and you don't question why it works. It just does. So this is the final sequence from the collection is called Fire, and each section is titled after the word that makes up the title of the collection. So Parse Tree, Forest, and Fire. This is a mix of Singlish and English, so good luck to to those of you who don't understand Singlish. Use your ears. I find that in the face of incomprehensibility, the easiest way to understand something is to simply listen. And this is 6 minutes long, so yeah. Orential trade, subway, depending on location of culture, blah, 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 qua, qua, MTA, MTR, MRT, NTUC. Hey, wait, subway, train, metropolitan transit, miscarrying horse, bowl, gent, dress, no. Spokes of the wheel, yes, base of the Rome, screeching, 50 asymptotes in place, whose the purposes of will not be sufficient metaphor of thought, though can, I think, finally. But if X percentage utilizes public transport, Y million angrily cascade through Z dollars, then yet spent, shouldn't there be a Tsainali master plan? And do XXX, let's be clever then. Ever cascading summer sheets, nay, cultural desert heat in sheets and haze. Hujan, damp, destroyer of plans, puddles, pooling access, OL, pining umbrella, lost, huh? What? Never hear office lady before? Come from where one? From breakfast before man grass, frittered attention? Sang banana is not the only frittered fruit, which means as in end, as in what means is subpar, for it's all in the head, all in the head, located, described, and scribed at the root of never ever changing grievance against trees numbered and truncated, belated dirt, slated, always late landscape. And if that got to do with trunk tract, sourcing end for the ungraved, it isn't far, da, salah, always intended to, but never for against. For if fictions gain grain, then never is the case. Now is the something else that is about, and so obfuscate, out clear sky, out topical tree, out loose leaf, out monsoon sun, escape until warm ought to be trapped instead of penned in frigid. Pina in the penal chronoloscopy, stationary story as follows. Suppose a man cycled on a path cutting fields. Suppose the man capped by mountains. Suppose the man wears a coat, or the coat the man. Suppose fog. Suppose December. Suppose the coat now has use. Suppose the highway cutting field cut by path has man wearing coat man, and he will say where to, behind again law, maybe as wrong locale, incorrectly local, or in the ethnography that describes pot, receptacle for odd, and notes on a bar, already filling in. There's someone named, penciling in, ni and you and kao and ta and dia. Also you, yes. What's in a name, Emerson? Here to collect, Emerson. The promised spaceship where, Emerson? Break the joints of reality and all the frictions come screeching. Fact-checking the signs. This man is actually bureaucratic. It's actually under a Mahabodhi thing. Malignoquin, oh Siddhartha Gautama and his sermon and all to listen. This wigless man, Bayon smile, because they always smile. It makes them look happier, more real. But who, Dulu Vinci with pale beard, as if that deserves praise. Aya, Bayon Lisa then is the real. Okay, this one real. The real puzzle edition of endless tree saving, villagers and slit paid witness to double repressive, academy obsessed by unintelligible drift, but didn't sufficiently, thus now urged to ring about, provide, think of one or two or all, to consider the what was, the how, the could it have been, the in any order, and include usually, statistically speaking, always yearning teller in the number in the year of our ord. Though pertaining to nothing, where got real plea, pleases see less in every language, no evidence of acre and the body shrunk to scale. I is to ratio, can keep up explanation, tissued in advance as to gleaming rude, as to concrete weed, plainly, if only, but tata sini sana mana angka boleh belok kiri masuk, presuppose the uninterrupted, well-worn mouth, yes, press pants, yes, starch shirt, yes, batik what measure, yes, and speak good, always good to burn the pyro with, rhyming, bringing birds back, right, and what next for the next trick? How else can one spin with garden variety, describe the upside down Avioli city, become kopitiam realness? Okay, Chino here and Egg Susan, lazy Sun Kui there, land of sustenance is always too much, dissecting of limbs, unhealthy obsession with eyeballs and oil, except the lifeblood of supply chain management, busting wallets in palm, which is the Lord. Suited man aghast, how can you have soup on a perpetually supple day? Of course we must talk about always never not balmy, the land slathered in tiger balm. Freud didn't account for the coming hellfire south of Oostenrijk, did he? Other is sun without reference to cold snap, thus hopelessly lost, navigating aphasia, the Latin root and talk tree, spoken turned inward like a sock, sharply English. This is the found interrupt. This is the finally allowed to wallow, smother, winning divine bet, masticating past loquacious throat, securing for future, yang di pertuan negara, a much significant, I'm possible, never again on seas, and finally, thank you. Told you it's 6 minutes long.
Thank you so much, Hamid. So I'm going to just ask a question or two, and then I really want to open it up to the audience to have a conversation. So the title of our panel is Re-envisioning the Epic for Our Time. And I actually have a question about is what you all think of as the definition of epic, because is it simply a long poem? Of course, traditionally, epic has been tied to the nation state, to usually the founding of a nation, as with the Aeneid. But I think there's an interesting question whether the epic form, and I'm interested in the idea of form that you brought up. I mean, like as with the great American novel, the idea of the big book or the long poem, is that something that is tied inherently to sort of colonial ideas of sort of muscle flexing or, of grand narrative. And so I'm actually curious how the three of you, do you see your own poetry as challenging epic or re-envisioning epic, or can one have a diasporic epic? Because I'm thinking about the earlier panel today. So you can respond in any way.
I mean, like, last night when I was reading, is it closer? Oh God, okay, all right. Okay, no, last night when I was reading Jay's book, I felt like this has a feeling of epic, and I was trying to isolate that. And I think that what happens sometimes in epics is, you have this sprawling canvas, these landscapes, multiple landscapes. But in the middle of that, you can have such intimate moments, like such tiny, and the fact that these moments crop up, we're cropping up with your work, that somehow put me in that zone, and then there's always a whole question of what the relationship between the epic and the lyric is. And someone said, which I think is partly true, is that in some way what I did in my book was just to try to isolate a whole bunch of lyric fragments or lyric moments in this larger epic. Yeah, I mean, look, about the nation, and I see the way I think about it, especially the Ramayana, is that it shows so much of trace of being, having been an oral text, as being part of a bardic tradition, and so it would have been completely oral and people would memorize the full thing, but then they might also ring changes in it. They will have stock expressions, they will have improvised sections in it. It's a whole kind of oral tradition, and it has a complex relationship with the state, because the poet is on one hand someone who stands outside the state. So that keeps playing out again and again in terms of Valmiki, who becomes a character in the book and is outside of it, and then when Rama banishes his wife in a rather shocking moment, and Rama's twins are born in the woods, and so they're raised as poets, and so Rama's encounter with his estranged children again is that they're actually telling the Ramayana. And he doesn't realize it's his own story. So there's a complicated relationship. At the same, I think that in my reading of Valmiki, I felt that there were a lot of moments where the poet is also arguing with the king, and the poet is also making us think about troubling questions about statecraft and so on. And that's what I ended up kind of isolating. But I wanted to say one more thing, which was going to be my shtick for this panel, which is that we really should kind of work with more non-Western epics, and I say this as someone, I mean, I love Homer and all of that, and I love the Anglo-Saxon tradition and all that, but there's this kind of a certain way in which the Greco-Roman tradition gets normalized, and then sort of normalized as part of a kind of Western tradition or something. And I've had to learn this the hard way, really, because to find out that my book that Valmiki was not going to get the same reception. And I was told by a very senior poet that this book would never be published in the US because it just requires too much work, too much knowledge, and so on and so forth. Whereas when you're presented with, a reference to Elpenor, or something like that, and then you're treated like a fool if you confess to not knowing the Homeric reference, and so you do the work, and so I think that so I wanted to argue for and I wanted to I don't know, I'm sorry, I just wanted to talk about what it means that to be able to tap into the resources that we may have inside of us, because I want to disabuse this idea that I am this native singing his song, right? Because I'm estranged. Indians are estranged from the Ramayana, and they're certainly estranged from the Valmiki. Very few read it, and so there are these levels of colonial breaks that one has to. So one feels inadequate. One feels like, okay, I'm not the real thing, so I'm not going to do this. And what really changed is when I met, a Tamil scholar and all that, and he'd been in Madras all his life, and he said, we all had to do that work. So there are a couple of catches if you are. One is that, sometimes it can be an advantage to be a bit of an outsider. And the second thing is that there will be work to do, but you have to. There are no shortcuts, both for a reader and for a writer, and I think that what happens also is that you have to be ready for. I don't believe in romanticizing this tradition that I come from, because if you really go into the history, you see the complexity and problematic nature of it. And for instance, at least in the frame of it, this version of the Ramayana as a deeply patriarchal text. It's all about, father and son and so on and so forth. And so when I gave myself permission to engage in a critical dialogue with it, to refuse things, that can be difficult, but sometimes it also yields a lot of richness and complexity. I remember recently I was hearing some South Asians talking, South Asian Americans, and their kids say they don't want to hear about caste because it's not their problem, So there's a fear of what you might find if you actually go into the text, and it may not be what you want it to be. So you have to be ready to deal with that. And I also think that there's no way to kind of get to a pure form of the text. So you have to accept the whole history of Western scholarship around it, and the whole, and that can be incredibly enabling. Like Sanskrit dictionaries were compiled to help colonial control, but then now I use those same dictionaries. So you have to be able to embrace it in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you. And I just wanted to let Jay and Hamid.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
No, I mean, I actually totally agree, Vivek. I think that's a very good question, and it's a question I've been asking myself as well when I was writing this book and after. And I guess I'll just talk a little about my relationship to Greek epic in particular, and then maybe sort of return, because I think the question is it's so fascinating, and it's one that has often been discussed, especially in post-colonial contexts, right? Walcott's one of my favorite writers, and he's often been like, well, why are you writing about Greek myth too? For me, ever since I was young, I fell in love with mythology, as I'm sure many of us did, and especially because, I don't know, there's something, especially as someone who is marginalized, it felt like a very safety net to fall into when I was younger. And then, as I was reading ways that many Western writers have rewritten myth, they've become touchstones in my own poetics, Anne Carson, Alice Oswald, Derek Walcott, of course. But then, I felt that it's, and it wasn't until I was starting to read more about the sort of scholarship that's been done around mythology and thinking about the sort of, why am I so seduced by the epic, by the sort of hero's journey, and this idea of a quest. And when I was reading back through Homer, I felt that actually what I really wanted to sort of excavate was a sort of, those moments of enchantment where the language or some sort of motif or symbol sort of leapt out at me in a way that perhaps would defy the sort of narrative of the epic, which is quite a sort of structured, sort of regimented narrative, which a nation-building narrative, right? A narrative that sort of prioritizes reason and logic of man, of the hero. And so, I was interested in the sort of, strange ecology of the myth, of the epic, the sort of a tree branch, or the ghost of Elpenor, who is a sort of minor figure in a way, in the myth, or a veil, or a tree that grows into a bed, and sort of that enchantment, those motifs and impressions. I wanted to build something around it, but definitely not, I'm not rewriting in any way at all, and I would really go against people who say that, right? Who might say that, because actually I'm not, it's not traced perfectly on. There are diverging paths, there are digressions. I'm bringing in other sort of narratives too. We're not following the same path, but rather we've sort of you said something when you were introducing, it went through you, right? Like a sort of ghost almost. It went, I let it go through me and sort of picked up what was sort of left in that sort of era. What did I want to respond to? Yeah. why this? And it's funny because as someone, I love Chinese like mythology too, and epics, and
And I'm not creating any prohibitions.
No, not at all, not at all. No, but I think it's a pertinent question, and actually, maybe this is something we could talk about. But like, I definitely feel a part of me was conscious that as someone who is queer and Chinese, and to a lesser extent Scottish in the UK landscape, that my work would be read in a particular way and has been read in a particular way, and that actually, if I was to write something which took the form of, say, Dream of a Red Chamber or Journey to the West, it would actually be so beyond the work. Even now, the work is not being put in. The book is, it's based on the Odyssey in some ways. The title is Latin. The front cover is an Irish painting from an Irish myth, but the book is set in like Asia and the Middle East. Like in many ways, like, the work is not being put in now to sort of like easily deal with that. And, so I consciously, subconsciously, and maybe this is bad of me to, think about the reception when I was writing it. But, there is something there about, if this was in, Journey to the West, I think it just wouldn't, no one would read it, in the UK. Thank you.
I want to read it right now, actually.
Okay, so first of all, I want to directly answer the question as to whether or not I think my work is epic. I think my work is epic insofar as it covers many different subjects, some opaque and some slightly more clear. But one of the things I think I see in epics that does not happen in my book is that there's always a focalizing character. There's always someone in the text that you can follow that becomes you or you become it. With my book, because it toggles between so many different languages, what happens is that the reader, in trying to find the speaker, the subject, is unable to find, it's only able to find some partial figure. If anything, they face themselves, because the languages will give you access to what you can read and understand in the text, and whatever that's opaque to you becomes something else, becomes something other. So a term was tossed around, the term was a-epic. I'm not sure if it's a-epic. It's capacious. The book, I think it's more fun when I perform it versus when people read it, because when they read it, they don't know how it sounds. And yet it's so intimately tied to my voice that if I die and no one records me, then well, good luck. That's how you have to reconstruct historical documents, etc. But to me, my books are intensely oral. They rely on the voice. They rely on my voice to speak it into the world. And maybe in that sense, it's epic. Mm-hmm. As to this parallel conversation that's happening now about the anxiety of influence, I want to say that as someone who is Malay and who none of you here, I think maybe 10% of you here probably know what a Malay person is. It is a great joy to not have to deal with questions of representation when the terms of representation are unnamed. I don't have to, sure, I read, as any marginalized subject in the world, you always have to read books in which you don't see yourselves. And then what you have to do next is to translate that books so that they meet your experience. So we're doing that all the time. We're doing that work all the time. It's invisible work. And so if someone like Jay, for example, writes something that draws on Journey to the West, I find it kind of ridiculous that people are not able to put in that same work to then translate themselves into a text that they don't understand, when people like us have been doing it for such a long time.
So the whole point of being a colonial subject is having to mug up the stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you always have to be prepared when you walk into the room.
Okay, I have one more question, and then I'm going to open up to the audience. So this is, I think, it's a two-part thing, but I think the two parts are related. So and you guys have touched on this a little bit, but one question would be the sort of, in the West, the kind of ideological cast of the epic, of certain epics. And I think with Homer and obviously the great classics, it is this sense of like mastery that one should know it, one should know the references to it, right? And but also more recently with avant-garde poetry and poetry in the 20th century, for example, Pound's cantos. But I'm also thinking of things like going further back, Wagner's Ring Cycle and things like that. There's a certain troubling ideological cast, let's put it that way. And I'm wondering, you know, in thinking through the epic as a kind of form of mastery or domination, or as I referenced, the colonial aspects of it or the encyclopedic aspects of it. Are there ways, and this is tied into the question of gender. So this is the other part of the question, which is that it's very male. It's usually very straight male. You know, it's the hero, right? So how can one queer the epic, or how does one think through that? It's a troubling legacy. I mean, there is unfortunately a lot of baggage, you know. And I was thinking through the idea of ideology, because earlier in the panel about diasporic poetics, I was thinking that ideology is actually one aspect of diaspora that we don't think about a lot, which is that people do get scattered, and then people have very different politics, and that's obviously tied to, you know, class and all sorts of things. But even in one family, like I can think of my family that, you know, I've like ardent Trump supporters who are first cousins, and so I guess I'm just thinking through that the epic is not a neutral, obviously, nothing is, no poetic form is neutral. All poetic form is not only thematically, but like in its own materiality, in its own form, very much influenced by national ideologies and other kinds of colonial ideologies, and gender and class and race. So I'm just wondering how you all think of this. Anybody have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, for me, you know, like I'm thinking of Simone Weil's, you know, reading of Homer, for instance, but also, you know, for me, there's a kind of duplicity that I can never quite resolve, right? That on one hand, it's a poem in praise of a king and in praise of conquest. But on the other hand, it also seems to be a kind of running critique of the king and running a critique of conquest. And I think in the case of the Ramayana, you know, the sadness of power, that what it means to have power, to exercise it, but then also to have that all fall apart. And so you know, so there are these kind of competing visions of it, right? And that's also becomes the legacy. So there's a kind of martial legacy. So you know, in India today, you have Hindu nationalist mobs shouting, you know, Jai Shri Ram in the middle of lynches. So there's a kind of martial legacy that comes out of the Ramayana. But then there's another legacy which is actually, you know, really kind of questioning the idea of power. And in that legacy, the dominant mood of the Ramayana is the Karuna Rasa, or pity, the sense of sadness you feel for all the beings in it, you know, and the sense of sorrow you feel on reading it. And so that one, so I found when I was reading in the interstices that both of these things are going on. And the only way I could resolve it, right, is that, I mean, the poet is a low caste figure especially in the case of, you know, Valmiki is sometimes understood to be a Dalit, but has this kind of ritual power, this power of enchantment. And so you're commissioned to write a praise poem for a king, and you have to praise the king, otherwise you get your head chopped off, you know. But then you put all of these other stuff, and that's what makes it a great poem, different from 20 other praise poems, which all hail the king, because this has got, you know, some of the kind of the sadness of what it means to the consequences of the exercise of power and the consequence of violence, of random violence, you know, that runs through I mean, I know that the epic is, but I just want to kind of complicate it. That's another way. So there are many there are many in the Ramayana and many names given for the Ramayana. but one of them is Sitaya's Charitam, which is the woman who is actually at the heart of the epic, and who is the sort of emotional heart of the epic, who is an abducted woman. And so this is a kind of constant figure, this whole idea of what happens to the abducted woman. Can she be returned? Is a woman property, or is she something more? This is kind of something the epics are constantly kind of troubled by. So I don't know, so consciously or not, like even though there's maybe an ambiguous agenda, I also feel like there's all this stuff that's kind of troubling it, and these questions that don't go away. And that's why it lasts. It's because for me, the critique is why it lasts.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's interesting because it's this book really feels like when I was writing it, I did have this idea of like queer relation in the forefront of my mind, even though it's actually nowhere on the blurb, right? And which is itself quite interesting, because I really didn't want to sort of have it misread as sort of like, oh, this is a queer rewriting of the Odyssey, right? Or like, which is that kind of rewriting can be quite trendy. And but for me, it's everywhere in here. The first poem I wrote for this came out of me reading about HD and Briar, that relationship, and then there's moments in which Elpenor I've sort of taken and sort of recast Elpenor, the figure of, as a sort of young queer sailor. So for me, that sort of like in the work, in ways in which I think manifest for me through this sort of sense of form, and I think we're all really interested in form, and the ways in which form can resist ideologies, right? And for me, that to distill that even further, it's the way that forms can resist language. Forms can sort of explode and break down language. And that is something that I think I'm very interested in.
What I want to add to the discussion is the word translation. I find that translations can also trouble the epic, as being something received, something whole. I feel like epics are very self-contained and seem to speak from outside of the realm of our experience, and so it becomes untouchable. But I think of Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, which when I read the first few lines, I was just gripped by how, one, contemporary, but also how of our time being placed in the world, right? With all of its difficulties. And to some extent, like the work that the two of you are doing are also a kind of translation, a kind of updating of these stories that have come down to us. And they will join that sea of references, right? That these books will live on, and others will pick them up and read them and form their own connections, and may one day write into that as well. So this is just to say, like, it feels very optimistic, very not me, but that's the work that we do, and it's just chipping away at that block. That word epic, which is epic in itself, big, right? Yeah.
I'm just struck by how. I'm just struck by how translation is a figure in all three of our work, and maybe that's no coincidence, And I think is it I am the translation machine? Is that the line?
Yes.
Yes. That's an earworm if there ever was one.
Check.
I am the translation machine. There's a line from Facebook, which I was like, yes, that's right. I am the translation machine. So it's.
So I think we have about 10 minutes for just discussion, open discussion and conversation with the audience. So if people have questions, feel free to raise your hand.
I'm holding on to the mic, so
Yeah.
I'll come to you.
Yeah. Sean.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. This is less of a question than it is just an invitation. I would love to hear your thoughts, since you brought up how optimism is not really you. I'm really interested in hearing about the relationship between your ideas of epic now, as you have been as just the stories have moved through you, and pessimism, actually. And I'm interested actually in that kind of discursive space, because I think maybe a canonical epic is maybe one of militant nationalism that is supposed to be very optimistic in a certain kind of way, and you inhabit the body of an optimistic conqueror. But so I'm interested in pessimism as a generative mode in each of your works.
Well, since I painted myself into this corner, you might as well try to walk out of it. I want to go back to the idea that I mentioned earlier about my book not having any particular subject position. I find that the more I write and the more I write and the more I kind of explore the things that I want to write about, I become more obsessed about creating presence on the page than I am with trying to create a subject. Maybe this is simply anti-epic in a sense, like trying to get rid of this focalizing figure that is often marked by colonialism, the ways in which we've been over-explained and over-represented and then made to, that there is, I live in this body and I experience the world, but there's always this box in front of me that sort of, and that becomes the constraining sieve by which people identify who I am and what I'm capable of. And so the self is such a pain. And it's so much easier to be a presence, to be in the room, to be seen, to be heard, and to then leave the burden of explanation to those who are looking, and not the one who's being seen. I'm not sure if that really answers your question. Perhaps it simply troubles the idea of the epic device as being nationalist, because a nation is an imagined community. And if all of us disappear and we all become presences, then I'm not sure if there's still a nation there.
Yeah, I mean, pessimism is so interesting, and I must admit it's not something I have really thought about, other than perhaps, having read a lot of like Afro-pessimism, so I sort of associate those two together. But to maybe think about negation, if I may take pessimism into a slightly different territory, I think I'm interested in the negation of language through different ways, through form. I'm thinking about what does it mean to, and I other projects of mine have been really thinking about what does it mean to, actually, one of my other pamphlets is based on the I Ching, which is something I'm continuously fascinated by. But sort of what would it mean to destroy, to annihilate, to catastrophize superstructures like myth or divination? I have one of my favorite artists is Cornelia Parker, who some of you may know. She's a British artist who's famous for like blowing up sheds. One of her artworks is on the cover of Christina Sharp's In the Wake, some of which may be more familiar. But she blows up a shed, but then she suspends all the pieces in the moment of blowing up, so they're all hung down from a ceiling, and they sort of just stay suspended like that. And I have poems in here where I have done something similar to the book as a whole and created these sort of linguistic fragments, these sort of ruined sort of bits, these pieces of language, which to me is a sort of, a travesty, a catastrophe has happened to that. But then having it suspended and thinking through, that blank space, which we were talking about today earlier, what can be retrieved or recovered from there.
Yeah, such a beautiful question, Johnny. I found myself getting, talk about, whether, the problem of doing an epic, right, is that on one hand, it's timeless. So the events it presents, like, say, like a war and stuff, you feel like, oh, this shit has just been going on for centuries, kind of thing, and it's still going on, right? So what does that do to the idea of history? It fucks with the idea of history because it seems to align several different. It's exciting because it's time travel, but then I start to wonder, what does it do to the idea of progress and things like that? And I was very, very involved with this as I was working through this book, the question, and I got to the section on war, and I think great epics are actually very pessimistic. Homer is very pessimistic, and Valmiki is also very pessimistic. The war has all these scenes, for instance, where night falls, or there's so much dust that nobody can see anything, and so they're killing their own army, members of their own army, and all this. It's a very kind of a bleak, long section, and I wanted to, and inevitably in this case, it's getting tied up with the idea of India because of contemporary politics and things like that. So I found myself in that war section drawing on two archives, one on torture in Kashmir, a report of 432 cases of torture in Kashmir, and a Maoist martyrology. And I felt it was entirely appropriate because the Ramayana is an ethical way kind of processing these things. But it was extremely painful, and it took me into, a very, very dark place. And I think that's where readers struggle also as well, because it does sort of go into that dark place. And then when I finished it, I felt like I had sort of left an open, gaping wound, in the book. And that's when I realized, okay, this is why writers often turn to, at the end of their epics, they want to present some vision of paradise, And I don't know if I'm not sort of person to believe in paradise, but in the last section of the book, I started to explore that, because just some kind of vision of paradise or something like that I could put in there.
And I think there's time for one more question. Yeah, somebody have a question?
First of all, I love the musicality of the 4 accents on stage. Second, could you tell us what is your favorite epic?
No, what I've realized is that there's a shit ton of epics out there, and there's amazing stuff. There's a huge, so much stuff, and then there are oral epics, and there are still in India, you still have kind of epic performers and storytellers who are doing kind of 5-day event sequencing and things like that, and and then there are Zulu epics, and there's so much out there, and then and they have things in common, but they're different also. They can speak to each other.
Yeah, maybe I'll suggest, what I really love are the ways people have responded to epics for years. So I'm thinking of contemporary works which have really changed the way I see epics. Alice Oswald's Memorial is breathtaking and very pessimistic, but actually so beautiful. HD's Helen in Egypt is one of my sort of touchstones. Omoros by Walcott. Yeah, but even recent books, like I would class Zong by Ebno Bessie Philip as an epic. I think it's doing a lot in sort of it's working in a similar sphere, but for quite radical different purposes. There's so many. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm gonna cop out. The Book of Questions, Edmund Yabis, not an epic by any way, shape, or form, but it's so, it's so roomy. I would highly recommend that book to anyone if they're looking for something to read.
Oh, I would be remiss if I didn't say Sandeep Palmer, who's a mentor of mine, but also a brilliant poet, and she writes quite interestingly about various sort of myths.
And mine would probably be Aimé Césaire's Notebook of a Return to a Native Land. Yeah. I don't know if that counts as an epic. I don't know if it does, but yeah.
Sorry, what?
Aimé Césaire's Notebook of a Return. Yeah. So thank you, everyone, for coming out. And G, do you want to make anything? Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Please give a round of applause to our three panelists for their brilliant readings, musical, as Yongling said, and also their generous and insightful answers. And also please give a round of applause to Dorothy for moderating this conversation. Beautiful one. Thank you. The books of our panelists are actually available here, back of you. Kim is waving them now to you, so please go and check them out. Avail yourself of them. All right, to actually learn more about what they have been talking about. And I also want very, very quickly to actually thank the festival team, Singapore Unbound Festival team, many of whom are actually here, and they've been here like last night and tonight again. So I'm going to ask them to just stand up and wave so that people know who you are, so that you can go up to them afterwards and thank them if you wish, if you enjoyed tonight. And of course, I very much also would like to thank Kate, who is actually in the recording booth behind there, and her team at the People's Forum for being so helpful in mounting this event together with us. And of course, thank you everybody for actually coming and listening, with such intention and with such attention as well. We have refreshments there for you, so please come and actually help yourselves. There's alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages and food for everybody. So please stay around, talk to our panelists, talk to each other, let the conversations continue. Thank you so much for coming. Bye for now.
Good job. That was amazing.